before we start, I'm going to give you some vocabulary for this speech, if you want to take some notes. So, in the speech, which is about coffee, I'm going to talk about the Oromo ethnic group in Ethiopia, Oromo, O-R-O-M-O. And I'm also going to be talking about coffee rust, which in French is rouille du café, I think, and in Spanish is roya de café. And I'll be talking about crop yield, the yield of a crop, antioxidants, which is quite easy, artificial pesticides or fertilizers, and the International Coffee Organization. So, just so you all know. Okay, I'm going to get started. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you all. My topic today is coffee. Many of us like to start the day with a cup of coffee, but I want to go a little bit deeper and talk about the history of coffee, coffee growing regions, varieties of coffee, the global coffee industry, including information on organic and fair trade coffee, and a bit later on, if we have time, because it's quite a long speech, coffee drinking customs around the world. So I'm going to start with the history of coffee, which I believe Andrea went into a little bit earlier today. The history of coffee goes back at least as far as the 10th century, with a number of reports surrounding its first use. Coffee is thought to have originated in Ethiopia. The ancestors of the Oromo ethnic group first recognized its energizing properties. And so from Ethiopia, coffee spread to the Middle East, Persia, Turkey, and Northern Africa. And from then, coffee spread to the Balkans, Italy, and the rest of Europe, Indonesia, and then the Americas. So in the beginning, over these decades and centuries, there were hundreds of varieties of coffee. But only a few have stood the test of time, as coffee is particularly susceptible to diseases such as coffee rust. So now I've given you a very brief outline of the history of coffee. I'm going to talk about the different varieties. Today, there are two major varieties of coffee, Arabica and Robusta. Arabica coffee represents between 70 and 75% of world production, and it would be much higher if Arabica were not so susceptible to diseases like coffee rust. Robusta is of lower quality than Arabica, but it's also easy to care for, with a greater crop yield, almost double the amount of caffeine, and more antioxidants. And, of course, it's also less susceptible to disease than the Arabica strain. So we have Arabica and Robusta, but where are they grown? And who exports coffee? The world's biggest exporters of coffee are, in order, Brazil, Vietnam, Colombia, Indonesia, and Ethiopia. Vietnam is the world's single biggest exporter of Robusta coffee. And Arabica is produced all over the world, with gourmet varieties from Kenya, Ethiopia, and Colombia topping the list. These strains or varieties of coffee are smooth and mellow, with very little bitterness. So these are the countries that produce coffee. But what about the countries that consume coffee? Now, the countries of Northern Europe hold the current record for coffee consumption per person. It might sound surprising, but Scandinavians drink more coffee than the French, Italians, and Spanish put together. Those three countries are not even in the top 10 coffee-consuming countries in the world. In Finland, people drink 2.6 cups of coffee per person per day. In Norway, it's 1.9 cups per person per day. In the Netherlands, it's 1.8 cups per person per day. And Belgium comes in at number 9 at 1.3 cups per person per day. So I'm going to carry on with some figures now about coffee exports. Before I give you the figures, coffee exports are measured in 12-month increments, in 12-month periods, December to December. So we talk about, for example, the 12 months ending December 2015. So that's December 2014 to December 2015 exports. Now, coffee exporting is a $20 billion industry, and coffee is mostly consumed by industrialized nations. However, more than 90% of coffee is grown in developing countries. The global coffee trade is huge and it's growing, especially when it comes to Arabica exports. According to the International Coffee Organization, 70.17 million bags of Arabica were exported in the 12 months ending December 2015, compared to 68.96 million bags in the 12 months ending December 2014, the previous year. And for Robusta, 42.31 million bags were exported in the 12 months ending December 2015, compared to 45.8 million bags in the 12 months ending December 2014, the previous year. Now, the estimated increase in global coffee production in the 12 months between 2015 and 2016, compared to 2014-2015, is 1.4%. So in 1 year, from last year to this year, we've got an increase of 1.4%. The average annual growth rate in global coffee consumption since 2011 is 2.5%. And so, from these statistics, it looks like coffee will continue to fuel the planet in the coming years. Now we've talked a little bit about statistics, I'm going to move on to organic and fair trade coffee. First of all, organic coffee. You know, Belgium is a country that is crazy about its organic products. And in the case of organic coffee, it's produced under strict guidelines. And it's grown without the use of artificial pesticides or fertilizers. It's interesting to note that conventional coffee is grown with more pesticides than any other agricultural crop. Cotton comes second. So you can feel very smug about your organic coffee here in Belgium. As for fair trade, when we think of fair trade, what usually comes to mind is small coffee producers who belong to cooperatives. The idea is that fair trade guarantees a minimum price for these cooperatives. But with historically low prices, current fair trade minimum prices are lower than the market price. And fair trade certification is not free. There is an application fee, an initial certification fee, membership dues, annual audit fees, and more. So certification can cost thousands of euros for a single plantation. This means that large corporate farms can often handle the paperwork much more easily than small independent farms. And so, as a result, there are plenty of small independent farms that are not fair trade certified, even though they meet or exceed fair trade standards. And that's certainly something to think about, but now I'm going to focus on some interesting coffee drinking customs from around the world. I'm just going to give you a few examples, then we'll finish up. So for many people, as you know, I'm sure many of us as well, stopping at a certain point in the day to have some coffee is a nice way to relax and take a little break in the middle of your day. And coffee has come a long way since its humble beginnings. At first, Christians believed that coffee was a black, bitter invention of Satan, unlike wine, might I add, which symbolically was Christ's blood. But this changed in the 16th century when the Pope gave coffee his blessing. In some countries, such as Ethiopia, where coffee originated, coffee still has some religious connotations, but this is no longer the case in the West. as I'm sure you all know, unless some of you have some interesting coffee rituals that you'd like to share.
I have some.
I'm sure Chris will be delighted to share some of these customs with us later on. The last example I'm going to give is Scandinavian egg coffee. This is a traditional brewing method that's popular in Sweden, Finland, and Norway. The technique calls for a whole raw egg to be mixed with the coffee grounds before adding them to boiling water. And so the idea is that adding the egg clarifies the coffee and allows the grounds to separate properly from the water. So while this gives the coffee, apparently, I haven't tried it, a silky texture, some people have said the taste of Scandinavian egg coffee itself is like kissing a chain smoker. So not all coffee is good. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks for your attention.
You better remember the adverts before you were born. English to read like kissing an ashtray.
What was your thing? Did you say it was like